In 1939, Germany rocked the world by invading Poland. Ever since 1935, Germany had been pushing and testing the Western powers further and further, while defying the Treaty of Versailles. Germany built up a larger military, they remilitarized the Rhineland, they annexed Austria, they bullied and eventually annexed Czechoslovakia, and after all that, they went against Poland. At that point, France and Britain had had enough, and they refused German demands. But what if France and Britain had stood up to his demands a year earlier? What if, instead of allowing Czechoslovakia to fall, the Allies would have stood by them against German demands? But first some history. We all know what happened in our timeline, but what were the strategies behind what happened? What were the countries thinking going into the Sudetenland crisis? First we have Germany. Germany was divided at this point over what the smart course of action was. It is often debated if Hitler actually wanted war or was just acting tough to get what he wanted diplomatically, but most signs point towards Hitler actually more than planning to declare war on Czechoslovakia, and he did not expect the Allies to actually agree to his demands. During the Sudeten Conference, Hitler and Mussolini have been described as good cop, bad cop, with Hitler aggressively moving towards war, while Mussolini tried to position himself as the more reasonable partner, trying to move both sides towards a reasonable compromise. But it must be noted that Hitler was not an absolute ruler in Germany. A large contingent of the German General Staff was not happy about this upcoming war, believing that Germany could not win the war at this time. The Oster conspiracy was planning on coupping the German government in 1938, assuming that France and Britain opposed the Sudetenland Annexation. The pressure from the war would allow the conspirators to execute their plan, while the Czechs would be able to hold the Germans for a while if the invasion was indeed launched. In our timeline, the plot disbanded when Czechoslovakia was abandoned by the Western Allies. The propaganda victory for Hitler by the annexation and the weakness displayed by the West made the plot unviable, and the likelihood of German success increased massively. Remember this plot going forward. Then we have France and Britain. Why did they choose appeasement over confronting Hitler over the Sudetenland issue? France, at this point, was considered to have one of the strongest armies in the world, while Britain possessed the most powerful navy. Surely, with these advantages, they could just strangle Germany into submission. Why were they so afraid of Hitler? Well, the first reason is that Hitler was still considered quite reasonable by many Western politicians. The Treaty of Versailles was considered too harsh very quickly after the Second World War, and a lot of early German actions were just seen as Germany reverting the damage done unto them. Secondly, neither France or Britain really wanted war. The First World War was horrible for all parties involved, and no one wanted a rerun of this war. The fact wasn't necessarily that the Allies were afraid of Germany. In all likelihood, they might have been successful if they put their minds to an invasion, but they simply didn't want to try it. Finally, there were many in Britain and France which considered Germany as a valuable ally in a future conflict against the Soviet Union. Finally, I want to quickly discuss the Sudeten Germans themselves. From a hindsight point of view, these people are often forgotten. But what did they think of this whole affair? The second biggest Czechoslovakian parliamentary party were the German Nationalist Party, which sought closer ties or integration into Germany. In April of 1938, Czechoslovakia, under pressure of Germany, Britain and France, listened to the demands of the more moderate German Nationalist Party, and they granted large-scale autonomy to the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia as a whole adopted a pro-German foreign policy. The Sudeten Germans were largely pleased with these new arrangements. It was only the Nazi faction in Czechoslovakia and obviously Germany itself which were not. I say this to explain that about a quarter of the Czechoslovakian population at this point was German, and the more radical of them might side with the Germans if it does come to war. There is one important thing to note about the annexation of Czechoslovakia. While usually described as a small side note towards the Second World War, Czechoslovakia was one of the largest military producers in the entire world, compared to their size. Germany's industrial capacity increased massively with the annexation of the Czechoslovakian lands, and the final years of German militarization towards the World War were massively improved by these annexations. This is not to say that without Czechoslovakia, Germany is just a paper tiger, but it is still important to remember that this 1938 Germany is massively weaker than the Germany we saw in our timelines 1939 and 1940 campaigns, as they didn't have Czechoslovakia and they had 1 or 2 years less to build up their military for this invasion. So, what do we change in this scenario? In August of 1938, the Oster conspiracy messaged the British leadership. The German generals sent a letter to Britain, notifying them of their plan to coup the Nazi leadership, if only the British and France went to war over the Sudetenland issue. In our timeline, the British disregarded this message. For one, there was no easy way to validate just how strong this conspiracy was, and if they really were in any position to overthrow Hitler. But adding to this, the reluctance for war with Germans in general, and we have a Chamberlain which is not at all interested in what these German generals have to say. But what if this changed? What if prior to any negotiations with the German leadership, both Chamberlain and Daladier thoroughly discussed the proposal by the Oster conspiracy? Let's say more anti-appeasement figures in both countries have gained more prominence. Especially the autonomy of the Sudeten Germans gained in April of the same year would be used as a propaganda tool against further appeasement. Hitler had already achieved his goal of protecting the Sudeten Germans, yet he keeps demanding more. Can we even trust him? Adding to this, we will have increased Czechoslovakian pressures on the Allies to act. However unlikely it is, Chamberlain and Daladier decide to go with the Oster conspiracy and resist Hitler's demand for land in Sudetenland. So now Hitler has two choices. He can either set up his planned invasion into motion or decide to bide his time. Obviously, we can't look into the mind of Hitler and say for certain what he would do in this scenario, but we are going to assume that he still invades Czechoslovakia. Maybe, much like with Poland in our own timeline, he assumed that the Allies are just bluffing. But either way, as a result, Britain and France declare war on Germany and World War II begins around September of 1938. On the 28th of September 1938, Hitler launches Fall Grün, the planned invasion of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia would have already mobilized their army, excluding the radical Sudeten Germans that voted for right-wing German parties, to prevent army contingents from rising up against them. Furthermore, Czechoslovakia ensured that no army unit had less than 85% Czechoslovaks in them, to ensure that German or Hungarian elements could not take control over an entire military unit. It is also very important to note that Czechoslovakia had a robust conscription and military training program for over 20 years of independence, while in comparison the Germans had only managed 5 years, as the Treaty of Versailles completely forbid it. Czechoslovakia had about 1.25 million combat-ready forces. They had great defensive lines across the Sudetenland, with hilly terrain to boot. They had a decent enough air force, which, much like Germany, fought in the Spanish Civil War, and they had great anti-defense systems. Why do I say all this? Because there is a reason that the German High Command feared this invasion would not be wise for Germany. Could Czechoslovakia outlast Germany in a straight-up 1v1? Absolutely not. But could Czechoslovakia hold on for a long time? Almost certainly. In comparison to Poland, which was attacked on two fronts by two major powers and was part of the European plains, making fast and large-scale offensive a lot more easier, Czechoslovakia was a heavily defended fortress. So, let's dive into the war. Adding to these Czechoslovakian strength during the early stages of the war, we have the German weaknesses. The first one is that the Germans didn't really have a good logistics system to supply the Czechoslovakian front. There were almost no highways or trains going directly to Czechoslovakia, Adding to this, the first 5 days of the invasions would be rocked with bad weather in Czechoslovakia, meaning that air operations and tank movements would be extremely difficult to actually accomplish. Why do I mention all of this? Because a quick overrun of Czechoslovakia might be all that stands between the Oester conspiracy and Hitler. It is simply impossible to determine just how successful the coup would have been, had it really been executed. But if the war in Czechoslovakia is a stunning military success, much like Poland was, with Germany taking Prague in a couple of weeks, Hitler might have gained the trust of most of the general staff. But in this timeline, there is war with France, there is war with Britain, and there is a harshly resisting Czechoslovakia which does not surrender in a couple of weeks. I could not in good consciousness have allowed the Oester conspiracy to just simply work out had Czechoslovakia fallen. But I think there is enough reason to believe that with the disappointing war with Czechoslovakia, the Oester conspiracy has a serious shot at gaining enough support for a successful coup. Now, the plan by the Oester conspiracy was for Hans-Jürgen von Blumenthal to lead a group of soldiers to storm the Chancellery and kill or arrest Hitler. We are going to assume that this part of the plan works out fine. What happens afterwards? Well, either the coup goes flawlessly, and they capture Hitler and most of the German state apparatus just allows the new regime to move in. The alternate possibility is that Nazi sympathizers and disloyal elements come into conflict with each other in Germany itself. But either way, in this scenario, France and Britain are more than aware of the conspiracy and the goings-on within Germany itself. France and Britain are unlikely to march armies directly into Germany to assist the conspirators, but the new regime would stop fighting in Czechoslovakia and they would stop protecting the French borders, while any Nazi sympathetic forces would have to fight both. It is either a struggle which the conspirators and allies come out on top of, or the conspirators simply manage to take over. But either way, the Nazi regime is deposed and the new regime is now in charge and the war ends. The first issue of the new regime is Hitler and the other Nazis. Most of the Nazis would be put on trial for their crimes against Germany and endangering the nation. But what is to become of Hitler is a bit uncertain. Many elements of the conspiracy desire to put Hitler on trial, to prevent him from becoming a martyr, and to expose his crimes to the larger nation. I believe that what happens depends mostly on von Blumenthal himself, who would actually lead the force to capture Hitler. If Blumenthal captures Hitler, I believe Hitler would have been put on trial. But if Blumenthal had decided to kill the dictator right there, he could have done so easily. It is also important to note that whatever happens, these trials are internal German affairs. These are not international tribunes with France and Britain attend. Then, directly after the coup, Czechoslovakia would celebrate their great military victory, as the German soldiers retreat from any surrendered territory. It is possible that a minor territorial conflict erupts between Poland and Czechoslovakia over Zalesy, but this probably wouldn't escalate into a full war between the two nations. At this point, France and Britain would be bolstered, as they just defended their hegemonic positions in Europe and solidified their position as the defender of the smaller states, without having to commit to a huge and costly war. The new German government would try to have friendly relations with the Western powers. Speaking of the new German government, what would it look like? Well, this wasn't your friendly neighborhood democratic movement. These were largely people who sought to return to a pre-1914 Germany. These were German nationalist militarists. They sought to re-establish a German monarchy under the grandson of Wilhelm II and return elite rule to Germany. This would be a government led by the military and the nobles, with Wilhelm III being established as the ruler. Now, in the short term, Germany would suffer heavily from this change in leadership. The German economy would quite quickly crash, or the German government would continue to construct greater and greater government debt, leading to an ever bigger crash somewhere down the line. The new German government would have to reduce a lot of government spending to prevent this government debt from rising to even more uncontrollable levels. Where the Nazis had eliminated most of the unemployment by remilitarizing the nation using this debt, this would have to come to an end, as without the planned mass wars by Hitler, this debt is simply unsustainable. This economic crash would cause an uproar in Germany. The average German wouldn't care about government debt or the changing leadership, but what they would care about is that under the Nazis they had a job, and now they suddenly don't. Expect resistance from unhappy populations, especially the unemployed. But on the whole, I do believe that this government would be able to survive this short-term pain. The economic program of Stalin is often criticized for being too focused on heavy industry over civilian industry, meaning that a bad long-term economy was established in the Soviet Union. Germany was essentially in the exact same position as the Soviets. Sure, the Nazis had great economic progress on paper, but on long term this economic policy was unsustainable. Under this new German regime, the German economy would eventually start to rise in a more natural manner. The German economy would eventually still be by far the biggest economy in Europe. But let's zoom out again. Do you see a difference in the map? Indeed, Germany was allowed to keep Austria, making Germany even more dominant over the other Western European nations. Without colonies, Germany had almost twice the population of Italy, France or Britain. I have no doubt that Germany would eventually become the dominant European nation, especially in the Eastern European nations. But there is something even more pressing to discuss. What about the rest of the World War? Germany isn't the only aggressive nation in 1939. Italy would continue to do as it had been doing during the 30s. Be friendly with Germany, France and Britain in an attempt to gain more land without getting into major wars. At this point, Italy had already gained Albania and Ethiopia. Without the world wars, we can expect Mussolini to continue this course of action, trying to position Italy as favorably as possible towards the other major powers. Don't expect Italy to start a major war. And then we have the Soviets, who are a bit of a wild card. Stalin might still desire to seek to expand the Soviet Union, as the Soviet industry and the Soviet army expanded to huge levels. But without Hitler to distract the Western allies, Stalin would be a lot more hard-pressed for large-scale territorial conquests. Especially the smaller Baltic nations might fall, and Romania might be subject to a larger international crisis as Bulgaria, Hungary and the Soviets desired lands from them. But if the Soviets do start a large-scale war with a nation like Poland or Finland, I don't see the other European nations just standing by. France and Britain disliked communism, and the new German government would hate it. If Stalin plays it safe and goes for smaller gains, the Soviet Union goes into the 40s like it had in the past decades, mostly self-centered. But if the Soviets do go for massive land grabs, Germany and the other European allies would fight a war of attrition with the Soviets. Eventually, the Soviets would lose this war in some fashion. But, for this timeline, let's assume that the Soviets go with a more reasonable stance and don't start a major war. Then we get Japan, which would probably still attack the rest of Asia. With the American oil embargo, Japan felt like they had no other choice, and the Japanese believed that they could knock out the American fleet for a while, consolidate all of Asia, and get the Americans and Europeans to just agree to Japanese domination in Asia. Of course, this is not what happened. Even without the European war, it is very well possible that the Japanese managed to consolidate most of Asia under their banner. But there would be no idea of peace from the Western side. Without the distraction from Germany, the Allies would fight the Japanese with much greater intensity. So, in an alternate 1944, the world looks something like this. Japan would get pushed back and eventually be defeated by the combined Allied forces. I will keep saying it, but I personally don't believe that nukes were the deciding factor in Japan surrendering. With the defeat of the Japanese Navy and Air Force, constant land bombardments, and eventually a Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Japan would still surrender, if at least the emperor wasn't removed. This would very likely not be an American-dominated peace deal, like it was in our scenario, as France and Britain are still fully intact global empires fighting alongside America. The world would look something like this. And at this point, going into our timeline's Cold War, history would be completely different. The Second World War, if you want to call it that, was a rather disappointing affair in this scenario. Instead of the two power blocks of America and the Soviet Union, we have a much more multipolar world. Germany is still extremely powerful. Japan will eventually be returned to some form of unified democratic nation. France and Britain have a lot more to say about the future of their colonial empires. Italy remains a big player in Europe and will do everything it can to retain its colonial empire. And the minor powers of the world will have a lot more nations to turn to instead of just accepting either American or Soviet supremacy. I still think that large-scale decolonization would still happen in many territories, but the British and France will keep a lot more control and influence over their former colonies. These wouldn't be the great power mandated retreats forced by the Soviet Union and America, but a lot more slowly and strategically by France and Britain themselves. By giving independence and increasing autonomy, the Europeans would be able to keep essential aspects of the newly independent nations in their hands, much like France has done in West Africa in our own timeline. There would still be massive independent movements, and colonies like Algeria and India aren't sustainable to keep down long term. But France and Britain would remain to be global players in this timeline. And at this point, this scenario branches on way too much to continue. Nothing is certain from this point. How will nukes change this world? What does Germany do with its renewed economic influence? Does Germany liberalize by themselves, or does the military dictatorship join the fascist regimes as an acceptable government to hold for a nation in this timeline? Does the Soviet Union go for global communism somewhere down the line? These questions and more I will leave unanswered, but I hope you still found this scenario interesting, and have become even more disappointed in the failure by Chamberlain to deny the Sudetenland to Germany.